your slides. Wonderful. Okay, so her slides are up here, as you can see, and she's down in the corner if you want to see if she's making funny faces at us. And Deb, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, can I be heard very clearly?
Yeah, we hear you fine. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm absolutely honoured to be able to present here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and to thank Justin Barrett and Ryan for putting this project together, this very important project together, Rebecca for making the technicalities of today possible. And I'm very delighted today to present some of the work conducted as a collaboration between my lab here at Boston University and Li Qizhu's lab at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And just to say what a fabulous collaborator Professor Zhu has been. So I'm going to be really only presenting a small piece of the great deal of data that we have collected over the last 3 years. And as the title of my talk should be up there now, I'm going to talk about Chinese adults' intuitions about purpose in nature. Okay. So, a very influential proposal that you just heard Ryan discuss within the cognitive science of religion is the claim that religious belief, oftentimes defined as belief in supernatural beings, is a byproduct or a side effect of natural cognitive tendencies, natural tendencies of mind that are not only early emerging, but that they are persistent throughout human development, and that they are pan-cultural, that they are universal. And within that framework of byproduct theories, various tendencies have been emphasized. So there's been work done on agency detection biases, a lot of emphasis on mind reading or intentionality, sensitivities to other people's mental states. But today I'm going to focus on another candidate for which religion might be a side effect of this natural tendency of mind, and that is the promiscuous teleological, the very broad purpose-based tendency to construe living and non-living natural phenomena as existing for a purpose. This is the tendency to explain natural phenomena in terms of some purpose or function, as though they are designed. And an example of that might be the belief, for example, that rivers exist so that fish will have a place to live, and that clouds exist to provide us with rain. So I'm going to try and keep my talk simple today, and first of all, give you some background research on work that's been done with children and adults in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about Britain also. But the bottom line, or the summary of that prior research, is going to be that we find that this broad tendency to explain living and non-living natural phenomena as though they exist for a purpose emerges early in children in the United States, and it also persists in adults. And actually it persists in a surprising group of adults, and I will talk about that more shortly. But the question that we're going to address in terms of the research, having laid out this background of the results that we have from America, is the really important question underlying the Chinese Challenge grant, which is this tendency, this promiscuous teleological tendency, is it pan-cultural? Is it a universal? Do we really find evidence that it occurs across very, very different cultural contexts? And that's when I'm going to be presenting research from the adults that we've tested in mainland China. All right, so here, let me tell you a little bit about the developmental work with kids in children in America and also in Britain. So we've conducted various different studies using various different methods with children, and one of the very child-friendly methods we've used involves simply asking children about natural objects, things like this pointy rock, and asking children to choose between different explanations for the properties of something like this rock. And what we ask them to choose between is a teleological or purpose-based explanation for one of its properties and a physical, causal, more scientifically appropriate explanation of its properties. And so I'm giving you a couple of examples here for the kind of explanations they get to choose between. So they could be asked, why there were these rocks around a long time ago? Why were the rocks pointy? One person thought, and here's the purpose-based answer, one person thought they were pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them. And another person thought they were pointy because bits of stuff piled up for a really long time. And so you can see that the purpose-based answer, the teleological answer, is not only ascribing a purpose to the pointiness of the rock, but also implying that it might be alive in some way. But another example is where we, another kind of purpose-based explanation that sort of suggests that the purpose of a rock might be to serve others. And so children could pick between an explanation such as why were the rocks pointy? They were pointy so that animals could scratch on them when they got itchy, versus they were pointy because bits of stuff piled up for a really long time. And so we're interested to see what the extent to which children like the purpose-based answer. And I'm presuming, as all adults in this room, that most of you are finding this purpose-based series of answers, regardless of the kind of function, a little bit ridiculous and something that is not valid. Okay, so is it the case, though, that children from early on share that intuition, share that bias or tendency that we see in educated adults, or do they lean towards a purpose-based explanation? And here's what you see, and this is data from American children, and you can see at the very end, this is what's being shown here is the tendency to endorse the purpose-based teleological answer, regardless of kind. I've collapsed it across the different kinds of purpose-based response here. And this is their tendency to say that things like, for example, that rocks are pointy so animals can scratch on them when they're itchy. And you can see at the very end, you can see the gray bar of adults, and they reject that. They say rocks are pointy because bits of stuff piled up for a long time. But what you are seeing in 3 and 4-year-olds through 8-year-olds is that they show a very different intuition. They like the purpose-based answer, and they like it regardless of the specifics of the kind of explanation it is. Okay? So we see from 3 and 4 years of age that American children are developing this teleological bias that seems to start going away around 9 to 10 years of age and is not seen in this kind of forced choice task, in this kind of task where children and adults are picking between explanations, is not seen in adults. So you see it looks like it's going away, but it's certainly present from very, very early on. And I would just add that in addition to seeing this tendency emerge in 3 to 4 years among 3 and 4-year-olds in the United States, British children, and Britain is an interesting case because it's a lot less religious than the United States, you see the same patterns in British 6 to 10-year-olds. We haven't tested 3 and 4-year-olds there yet. Okay, Is the volume, my voice coming across okay?
Very well. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So hopefully this is all clear that we're seeing this purpose bias, this teleological bias from 3 to 4 years of age, and it's quite strong. And so, but the teleological bias might not be interesting with respect to understanding religious belief if it's the case that it simply just goes away. And you're seeing from the graph I showed you that it looks like it goes away, and that this very broad tendency to think things exist for a purpose in nature disappears around 9 to 10 years of age in both American and British children. But what's interesting about that developmental pattern is it's consistent with two different stories about what's happening, two different hypotheses about what the mechanism is that's occurring. And one possibility is that basically what we're seeing is the tendency is in fact disappearing, that all these purpose-based explanations are being replaced by scientifically accurate physical explanations as children become more scientifically educated, and so the teleological bias truly disappears. But another possibility is that it doesn't actually disappear, and that what we are actually seeing is it's as children and adults accumulate and grow more scientific knowledge, what is happening is it is hiding the teleological bias. It is making the bias, it is masking the existence of the teleological bias, which actually remains as a default or preferred way for us to explain things when we don't have time to think, or when we are just left to ourselves to think about things rather than being put into a circumstance where we're feeling like we have to give a correct answer or we're being judged. So it's possible that in fact the purpose bias persists throughout development, but it's hidden from view most of the time. And so what's nice about this hypothesis that the teleological bias might persist and just be hidden from view is that we can test it using some of the methods from cognitive psychology. And this is exactly what we have done, which is the prediction is, if it's the case that the tendency is only hidden from view but continues to exist, that when we take even individuals who are extremely highly trained in the sciences, physical scientists, for example, and we put them in conditions where they don't have time to think, where they don't have an opportunity to censor or stop their natural or gut intuition, we should see evidence that they default to purpose-based teleological explanations of nature. So the method that we use is that we ask adults to judge explanations at speed when they don't have very much time to think, to see whether, when they don't have very much time to think, they actually show signs of liking purpose-based explanations of nature. And the strongest test of the hypothesis that the teleological tendency is only masked is one that we conducted with professional physical scientists who have very strong norms and biases, professional biases, against purpose-based explanations of nature, as well as very strong and full scientific knowledge. And so if we find evidence that they default to teleological purpose-based explanations when they don't have time to think, then that's pretty strong evidence that this is a natural bias of mind that never really goes away. And so that's what we've done in the past, and it's a study that we also brought to China. But let me tell you about the study with the American professional scientists. What we did in the study is we had physical scientists from institutions like MIT, Harvard, Yale. So these are people who are at the top of their field. And we also had comparison groups of people with far less scientific knowledge who were matched for age. So age-matched people with a college degree. And then we also had a group of undergraduates. And what they needed, what the task involved was a series of statements or explanations that were being presented one after the other on a laptop screen. And the only thing that the participant had to do was to judge them as either true or false. Now, the trick was that for half of the subjects in the study, each of those explanations only appeared for about 3,000 milliseconds, which is long enough for them to read it, but not long enough for them to entirely suppress or hold back their gut feeling about whether it was a true explanation. Then the other half of participants were able to take all the time that they wanted to judge the sentences. And there were two types of explanations. The ones we were very interested in were teleological explanations of nature, of natural phenomena that are completely scientifically inaccurate. And then a whole bunch of control explanations that we included to make sure that participants could in fact read at speed. That if we found, what we were interested in seeing is when they're tested at speed, do scientists start to endorse teleological explanations at a greater rate than when they are unspeeded? And we wanted to make sure that if we got that effect, it wasn't simply because they couldn't judge any sentences when they were under speed. Okay? So here's what we found. Here's some examples so you can see the kinds of things people are judging. So our test sentences that we were interested in, these are the same test sentences that I'll talk to you as being ones that we tested with Chinese adults in a minute. Examples are, the sun makes light so that plants can photosynthesize. And they had to judge, that's true or false. Or the earth has an ozone layer to protect it from ultraviolet light. Or birds transfer seeds in order to help plants germinate. Or microbes convert oxygen in order to enrich the soil. And in each of these cases, as is the case in all teleological explanation, a function or purpose is being used to explain why the thing exists or why it happens. And then you see examples of the control sentences that were included to see whether these adults could judge things at speed in general. We also, I'm not going to go into detail about this now, we also asked participants to rate their agreement with the statement, I believe in God, gods. This ratings of people's belief in God, gods confirmed that the scientists were largely non-religious. They were mostly atheists. And we also were looking at a measure of their general ability to inhibit themselves, a measure of their ability to stop themselves doing something, which is called the Stroop, but again, I'm not going to go into that in much detail today. So, but what did we find? And here you see the scientists in every single group that we tested, and you're seeing the scientists, this is the tendency to endorse the scientifically inaccurate teleological explanations as true. So the tendency to show a teleological bias. What you find is that in every group that we tested, even professional physical scientists who have very, very strong biases against purpose-based explanations of nature, They show low tendencies to endorse purpose-based explanations when they are unspeeded, but when they're speeded up, their tendency to endorse purpose-based teleological explanations doubles. And it's a good thing. I mean, it's nice when you look at this graph, you see that being a scientist buys you something. They're showing overall less of a scientifically inaccurate tendency to endorse teleological explanation than undergraduates or college graduates. But even with that, they show this pronounced tendency to default to purpose-based explanations under speed. It's also interesting to note that we also tested a group of scholars from the humanities, from departments of history and certain kinds of philosophy, and they actually perform very similarly to the scientists. So, in fact, being a scientist is not a particular protective factor to having a teleological bias. They show it to the same extent as people who are not trained, who are highly educated but not trained in the sciences. And I should add that all of these results occur in a context in which performance on the control items was over 90% accurate, and we got no comparable, no similar speeded effect on those control items. So it's the case that these tendencies to default to purpose-based explanation under speed are not explained by a general inability to read at speed. It's the case that when you don't have time to think, even if you're a professional scientist, you like purpose-based explanations of natural phenomena. Okay, so that's what we get with professional scientists in the United States. But, you know, overall, what I've shown you to this point is that we find this promiscuous teleological bias. It's early emerging, it persists across development, and is present even in professional physical scientists. But you could be saying to yourself, yeah, these are scientists from the United States. And so finding evidence that they have this tendency to resort to purpose-based explanations may simply reflect the fact that they are in a cultural context in which purpose-based explanation, as a result of the religious nature of the United States, is something that's in the air. It's everywhere. And even if they themselves are atheists, it's enough the case that they're immersed in a culture embedded enriched with a Judeo-Christian tradition, that what we're seeing is a very specifically American phenomenon. So what we've done in collaboration with Li Qizhu is we've been testing Chinese children on some of our tasks and Chinese adults. As I say, I'm going to talk about the adult results today. And so what happens? Do we see Chinese undergraduates show the tendency to default to purpose-based explanations under speed? The prediction here, in general, might be that if it's the case that the broad tendency to ascribe or to see nature as having a purpose is a consequence of the religious cultural context of the United States, we actually shouldn't see any tendency to endorse purpose-based explanations in Chinese adults, whether they're being speeded up or not. Okay, so it might be the case that, in fact, all of this is being caused by a culture that evokes God and design a great deal in the United States, and so we're not going to see any of it in China. So we did the same task that I've already shown you with a group of Chinese undergraduates that were tested through Professor Zhu's lab, and here's what we find. So I'm showing you again the scientists, the American scientists, near the axis. This is the tendency to view the teleological explanation as true, the test teleological explanations as true. There's the US scientists, the US undergraduates, and on the end here, the Chinese undergraduates. And what you are seeing here is that the Chinese undergraduates are showing the same kind of speeded effect, same tendency to default to a purpose-based explanation when they're speeded up as both the US scientists and the American undergraduates. In terms of and of course, what you're also seeing is that, in fact, overall, they are endorsing purpose-based explanations of nature, whether they're speeded or unspeeded. So, it suggests that the teleological bias is not something that is purely a result of or an artifact of being raised in a religious culture. What you also note, however, is that one pattern you're seeing here is that the Chinese undergraduates are more teleological overall than the American scientists. And in analyses that we've conducted, that difference is entirely accounted for, is due to the fact that the American scientists know a lot more science. So that's why the Chinese undergraduates in general are more endorsing of teleological explanation, as they know less science. But you're also seeing a pattern in which the American undergraduates are more teleological than the Chinese undergraduates overall. And in part, but not entirely, that difference is accounted for by the fact that the American undergraduates are more religious than or in terms of their endorsement of the statement, I believe in God or gods, the American undergraduates are more religious. So it's not the case that across cultures we're seeing exactly the same tendency to endorse teleology or teleological explanation, even though across all of the groups we've tested, we do see the same tendency to default to teleological explanations under speed. Okay? So I think I've talked for a long time now. I'll stop talking now. And I will just conclude for you by saying that we have now, based on this evidence, indications that this promiscuous teleological bias is potentially universal, as cross-culturally recurrent among adults. We find it in American undergraduates and scientists. I haven't talked to you about data that we have from Romanian Roma adults. We see it there too. And we see it in Chinese educated adults. Is it always early emerging? Do we see the same developmental pathway to this adult end state? Well, we see certainly that it's early emerging among American 3 to 8-year-olds. Now, I'm going to say to you that our preliminary data suggests that the bias towards purpose-based explanation is less marked in the Chinese 6 to 8-year-olds. But we don't know about the littler kids because we haven't tested them. So it's turning out to be a potentially very interesting story about how that bias towards purpose comes to be in adults, and when the tendency starts to emerge in children, and when it starts to get hidden in children. It's possible that it's present in very little Chinese children, but is getting hidden earlier. And certainly our Chinese data with some of the older elementary school children suggests to me that they know an awful lot more science than the American elementary school children. So I'll leave you with that, and just end by thanking so many people that we have to thank. This is really only a selection, and I want to again thank my collaborator, Professor Zhu, and Justin, and Ryan and the Thrive Centre and Templeton World Charities Foundation for funding this work. And thank you again for being such an attentive audience. Thank you very much.